All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Digital Futures of Education event. This is part of the Digital Futures Institute at King's College London's Digital Living Well with Technology series. I'm really happy that you're all here with us. I think that we're all very, very excited to get started here. I'm Dr. Michael Marcinkowski. I'm the Director of Education at the Digital Futures Institute. But before we get started, we have a few small housekeeping things to take care of. And so I just want to make sure that you all know that this event is going to be recorded and will be shared later on our YouTube channel. Only speakers have access to their microphones. So if you do have a question, we're hoping we'll have some time for questions at the end. And if we do, please put any questions that you have into the Q&A. The chat feature we won't be looking at that. So please use the Q&A feature to post your questions. If you have problems with the Q&A feature for any reason, you can put your questions in the chat and we'll move them over to the Q&A for you. But please don't use the chat for any other reasons there. We will be asking for feedback at the end of the event, and so please do stick around and complete that when we put it up. And this roundtable discussion is part of a broader series that is the Digital Futures Institute Living Well with Technology series. We've been running this for a little bit over a year now, I believe. Our inaugural lecture was from Stephen Fry, who talked about artificial intelligence. Just this last November, we had an event that was focused on quantum computing that was run in collaboration with King's Culture and the Science Gallery London. And the recording for that event will be available soon on our YouTube channel. And so please do take a look for that if you're interested. Our next event will be very appropriately next year in February, and will be focused on the digital futures of love. Just in time for Valentine's Day. And we also have some upcoming events focusing on the digital futures of film, art, music, and social care. So please keep a lookout for those. I think they should all be tremendous. I'm really excited about today's event because we're going to be talking about the digital futures of education. And I think that as everyone here knows, I think especially our panel members, the question of digital technologies in education is a very, very important question. It's a question that's a very, very complex and rich one. So I'm really glad to have such a tremendous panel with us today. Let me start off just by introducing the panel. Again, I'm Dr. Michael Marcinkowski, the Director of Education for Digital Futures Institute. We're joined by Dr. Felix Kwihangana, who's a senior lecturer in transnational education at King's, where he focuses on teacher education and digital technologies in under-resourced contexts. He's previously worked at the Manchester Institute of Education and which is at the University of Manchester. He's currently the convener of the British Educational Research Association's Digital Education Special Interest Group. We also have Dr. Sara Black, who's a lecturer in education and society at King's, where she studies the temporality and spatiality of everyday life and how this reproduces social inequality. She's been a maths teacher and a coder and was involved with the Center for Educational Rights and Transformation at the University of Johannesburg, and also worked in teacher development at the University of Cape Town. Mark Lester is the Chief Partnerships Officer at Fourth Rev, a company which partners with universities, like King's College London, to offer online career accelerator programs that give students direct pathways to qualifications and jobs in the digital economy. He was a co-founder of FutureLearn and has previously been the head of strategy at the head of the strategy unit at the Open University, as well as many other careers that he's had over the years. Professor Sara de Freitas is currently CEO and director of the EdTech startup Waypoint. She holds visiting professorships at the Open University and the University of South Wales. She's an honorary research fellow at Birkbeck University of London. Among her many, many other roles, she's held 8 professorships in the UK and Australia, and is a principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy. So I'm really, really glad to have our panel here. I'd welcome all of our panelists, and thank you for joining us here tonight. I think as everyone can see, we have more expertise in this area than we can possibly manage to get all the expertise out of, but we'll try as best as we can here. I want to start off just to give the audience a chance to kind of get a sense of what we should be thinking about here. So I want to ask each of you in turn. And I'll start with Felix and just go through the order in which you were introduced. But I want to start with this question of how do you think about education in the digital age? And what is, if the audience needs to think about one specific pressing issue that they might not be thinking about, what is that thing they should be thinking about? So really very briefly in a sentence or two, what is digital education and what is that pressing issue that we're facing? Oh.
Thank you everyone for joining us. I think today, what we are, if we consider our age today as an age of digital technologies, then the challenge we face is being able to figure out what the purpose of education is in today's societies. Because we could say that we are a sector in crisis in many ways. Crisis, some of which is created by the technologies we are using to deliver education, but also crisis because of the transformations that are happening in our societies that lead us to question what our societies are for. And if we try to figure out that, then education would finally find its rightful place in that society. So in a word, education is a sector that is still in the process of finding its purpose in the digital age, because society demands that we figure that out, whether it is figuring out how education plays a role in supporting the vulnerable, in supporting the youth, making opportunities accessible to everyone. In other words, what is education bringing to our societies, the value of what we do, and call it education. If you focus a little bit on higher education, you might say maybe it's even worse in higher education because we are a sector in turmoil for many reasons. In the UK, for example, there is an issue of financing education, there is an issue of accessibility, there is an issue of value, and all of those are things that make it harder to actually define education because we are still, at least at this stage, technologies mean that we are in a world where anything is happening, anything can happen. If an educator is trying to figure out something, how to deliver instruction, for example, and then you have some forms of technologies, or even an influencer saying, I can use these tools to do the same, then what's the purpose of education in that case? And that is why we are a sector in crisis.
Yeah, I think we'll definitely touch on a lot of those things. Sara.
I picked up on something similar to what Felix was saying around, well, it depends on what you define education to be for. And obviously we can go in depth about the difference between what should education be versus what is education. Those are not necessarily the same. But I found Maxine Green helped me think here, because you asked us, how do you define education in the digital age? And for me, I don't think being in the digital age necessarily changes what a real education is or what it means to be educated. She wrote something that I found really helpful. She said, for many individuals in a society, there's this feeling of being dominated and this feelings of powerlessness. And she suggests that feelings to a large degree can be overcome through conscious endeavor on the part of individuals to keep themselves awake. She defines being educated as living an awake life, a life in which you are analyzing the forces that are changing your circumstances, that you're understanding them day by day. And when you learn to analyze what's happening, you start to develop autonomy, you start to develop your sense of agency for living. I found that a very useful way of thinking about what education should be for everyone, whether that's adult education, informal education, children, higher education. And so if we think about what is education and what would that wide awakeness, that sense of being alert to the world and analyzing the world to the end of acting in the world be in a digital age, I think one of the pressing issues that we're facing is where's the locus of this agency? Because often we are more objects of our technologies than subjects. We are often more being subjected to the affordances and limitations imposed upon us by technology rather than being the creators of those limitations and those possibilities. And in particular, I think often sometimes the technology we use, particularly in education, but not just education, gives us a false sense of agency, gives us a sense that we are acting, but we're not actually changing the things that matter to us. We might scream at someone on Facebook, or we might have a personalized learning environment, but not realize the options it's not giving us. And so for me, what is education in this digital age, and what is getting in the way of that is, how are we wide awake and continue to be the agentic subjects of our technology rather than the passive objects of it?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Mark, what is your take on the current definition of education? What's important?
Well, I come from an industry perspective, and what I see, and I think there's Sara and Felix have made some very good points about being at an inflection point and actually understanding that education is very much depends on your perspective and where you are. But the way I come at this is that I think education hasn't, for many people, is a vehicle to advancement of their own, not only knowledge, but career, happiness, fulfillment in life. And most people going to university or schooling it is to fulfill that ambition to lead a better life, and whether that's in a spiritual or career sense or just general pursuit of knowledge. I think everybody finds their definition of happiness and defines in their own terms. But from the majority of people that we end up dealing with and responding to, I like to think of it as that we're trying to enable every person, regardless of background or geography, to be able to develop the sort of knowledge and skills and values to flourish in a digital society. And I don't say economy, I do society in a deliberate, because it's broader than just the economy. And that means being able to have the disciplinary expertise, the critical and creative thinking skills, ethical judgment, and the ability to work with technology. I think it's just increasingly important for people to have that. And so that's how I come at it. And when you sort of ask about a pressing issue, I suppose what's coming up for me, and I think largely of AI and the things that are happening in that's part that's disrupting us, is what I'm starting to see in my own life, but also what I'm seeing in like by students on courses that we do, is how they're using AI. And I think there's huge opportunities here, but there's also the pressing issue for me is the risk that students are turning to AI and people in work to perform tasks, all sorts of tasks that actually are weakening critical thinking skills and human judgment. And I think that we are going to have to start to redesign teaching and assessments to make the capabilities around those skills much more explicit and essential. And I think I just want to bring in a quote from Robert Hardman, a colleague of mine who's a chief AI and transformation officer. And he said, you can't prompt your way to intelligence. But I actually think a lot of people believe that they probably can and are doing so. And I think the challenge for us in this technology driven age is to make sure that technology is a catalyst for deeper learning and not a shortcut around it.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think AI is going to be something that we'll obviously come back to later in the conversation in some way. But Sara, what is your kind of present feeling about the role of education in the digital moment today?
So, well, I've been describing myself as a recovering academic. So, just to put it in perspective, I keep trying to get away, but they keep pulling me back. But I'm also, there is a bit of context to this, but I am also a systems thinker. And I think from that perspective, I look at education in terms of systems, I guess, and sets of systems and processes as well as being quite key. And education for me sort of branches off into two areas. One is the processes of teaching and learning themselves and the interactions between the teachers and the students, which I think is at the core for me of education, what education experience is. And then on the other side, the organisation of that and those sets of processes and delivery as well. And obviously what we've been seeing I don't think what we're seeing is a crisis, Felix. But I do think we've been going through a revolution, and we've been going through a quiet revolution over quite a long number of years, probably 50 years or so, which has brought us to where we are now, which is blended learning, more immersive learning, project-based assessments, and more active learning approaches. So those elements sort of come back together a little bit in the digital age because we have the capabilities to do so much. And for me, what's happening in this period is really the opening up of lifelong learning, both because we've got the capability to offer that and we've got more tools to deliver that, but also because people have the skills needs at the moment, and particularly with AI, as we've talked about earlier. So that's sort of how I see it. It's sort of interesting. There's a language link here for Sara, which is leren, and leren is a Middle English word which means teaching and learning together, and that word doesn't exist in English anymore, although it did exist in Middle English. It is still used in Dutch, by the way, and actually probably in your language as well, Sara, from your country. So but the idea of learning and teaching together for me is quite important. And I think what the revolution that we're going through and have been going through for quite some time allows us to do is to bring those elements back together, I think, and to look at the pedagogy, to support better pedagogies, and to look at the policy and the practices, and to ensure that those link clearly together. I think in terms of pressing issues, then obviously AI is one in terms of agentic technologies in particular, how we're going to use them, what that's going to mean. But there's probably a more insidious element onto that, which is what I've sort of called the systematization of human behavior. So being able to systematize that in some way. I think that these are all things that do throw up some ethical issues and things that we need to talk about and think about. We've talked about the lower motivation for students, but I think the other pressing issue really for me is really around equity of access. And we saw during COVID, some of the families that didn't have access to digital technologies, didn't have access to Wi-Fi connectivity and so on. There is a digital divide there in the country, and we need to address that, I think, very urgently, because we can't hope to offer, great experiences for all students if all students don't have access to the capabilities that other students have. So I think it's really important that we focus on the equity issue at this moment. I think that's everything.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much for all of those points. I think one thing that I was just thinking about based on that is kind of maybe think, Felix, of some of your work, particularly around teacher training, and what is the role of teachers in this pedagogy, in this kind of pedagogical situation, and how do we begin to train teachers and get them ready and prepared for working with people in these kinds of new environments? And I think looking at some of the questions of inequity, looking at some of the question of opportunity, what's that role for teachers here from your experience?
I think in this environment, teachers are going to play a very important role. Obviously, there are some schools of thinking where people think that the more technology you bring in the classroom, the less you need the teacher. But there is no education without teachers in the classroom, or wherever however you conceptualize the concept of classroom, that's a different debate. But if we are to actually have the form of education where you have those kinds of ideas Sara was talking about, where we train a society where people are compassionate, where there is humanity, where there is those ideals that bring people together to build the societies we want, then we have to train teachers with that in mind. And there are, of course, things that when things go well, we praise the policymakers, we praise the technologies or whoever made the technologies. When things go wrong, we blame the teachers. And therefore, we create that system where teachers are only responsible when things go wrong. And we are in some contexts, we are also seeing that there is a strong distrust for teachers. So we can't train teachers to become people who are going to be distrusted. We need to train them with the same humanity that we want them to go and impart on the students, on the world. Technologies can help us with that, obviously, but we also have to make that training accessible to everyone. And this is where it's very important when you start thinking about, for example, some contexts where access to education, is a problem because partly there is not enough trained, competent teachers to be able to deliver that kind of learning. And some Silicon Valley kind of tech moguls will tell you, well, we're going to give you an AI tool, or we're going to give you this software, and all your problems are going to go away. They will not go away because teachers are an essential component of every endeavor to change society. And if, like Mandela, we believe that society is the weapon that will transform our societies, then we need teachers in that classroom. But we have to train them with those values. We can't train a teacher when we don't have the ability, we don't finance them, we don't support their access to the technologies we want them to use. At least train them with those skills. We provide them opportunities to learn on the job. We provide them the opportunities to grow, basically, and then expect them to become the best teachers they can be, because you can't expect the best when you are not giving the best to someone. I think for us as educators, that's where we have to work.
I think thinking about this split between the technologies and the policies that are set up, and then the place that teachers are. I was just wondering, particularly from your perspective, Sara, what is that relationship between these kind of complicated pieces of social practices and technologies and policies? How do we begin to think about getting that right?
So, the education is always having these complex relationships to the social world in which it is a part of. So education is both influenced by and influencing of broader social fabric. And I think the relationship between digital tools and education and depends partly on what we discussed earlier, which is, what is education for and what are you trying to achieve? Felix already alluded to that about, how do you train a teaching force that has the values that go beyond just reproducing the same sort of thing. But I think it depends on how your education system relates to your forms of political economy. But if that's what makes an education system good, we're living in a moment where increasingly we have overqualification and underemployment amongst those who have had access to education, while the returns on formal education by a traditional narrow technicist sense is increasingly diminishing, what we call academic inflation. And this is producing a lot of unhappiness around the world. We're seeing that in the form of political populism, that the promises of this economic and social upward mobility is not manifesting for example, Generation Z as it did for their parents. So I think if we think about what education is and how that relates to digital tools, we need to think about how those tools relate to the purpose, because it's how we design and deploy them. One of the mistakes I think we make is believing that technology is neutral, it just depends on what you use it for. But the design itself, we have a lot of historical examples of where the design of technology is not neutral. So it's not just using the tools we have, but also how we design them as to whether they are going to create the kinds of future societies that we want our children to live in. I'll give you an example of non-neutral design. We've seen in AI training sets how it has replicated the social biases of the data sets and the coders who have been part of generating those systems. So if we imagine education, for example, as preparing students for the world of work, which is a sort of supply side element of thing, and don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we do not want students to have skills they can use in order to be economically active participants. Rather, I'm saying I think that education's more than that. But if that's what we think education is, then the digital tools will be put to and are being put to that purpose. But if you are thinking a little bit broader than that, okay, if you're thinking, well, actually, we need to be trying to transform the world we're in because it's not working for a lot of us. It's increasingly working for fewer of us as power and money and influence are concentrated in fewer hands. You just need to see how many of the oligarchs around the world are building doomsday bunkers, trying to get to Mars or creating seasteading to realize that they too can see things are not sustainable in the status quo. If we're thinking about that, then increasingly we need to be thinking about how we want to build digital tools for very different purposes. And there are examples of people who have done this. There are people like Aaron Schwartz, Alexandra Elbakyan, Audrey Tang, amongst others, who have tried to live up to the original promise that the internet offered us in the 90s. I remember being a coder in those moments. It was a bit Wild West. It was a bit anarchic in some ways, but it was an exciting moment when technology offered a genuinely emancipatory promise of taking power out of the hands of the few and the moneyed and the well-heeled, and allowing any of us to be coders, any of us to change the back code of the apps or the technologies. We could get into the Unix core and change it if we wanted to. You can't do that anymore. You can't do that. So I think, how do digital tools relate to education practices? If we're building an education system or trying to change our technicist education system to something fit for purpose, then the digital tools, the way we design and use them, will follow from that.
So I think you've raised some really kind of important critical points about this, and that relationship between our kind of economic aims and our social aims there. And so I wanted to ask Mark about this. I think a lot of your work is very explicitly about working with companies, trying to get that alignment between people's needs. And I think you talked about that a little bit earlier, about that, those hopes and aspirations. But there's this relationship between being able to educate people for the skills they need for economies. There's a thing about trying to work with companies and trying to figure out what are the skills that they need for employees, and there's a match there. How do you conceptualize that or think about that development between those two?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I fully accept that there's a wider angle to this debate than the economy and certainly building out, but as I say, it's an important one. Obviously, I think the link between employers and education is only tightening at the moment, and digital transformation is driving that. Employers need to upskill and reskill people very quickly. We already had a challenge before when a lot of the emerging middle classes in Asia, there's not enough places at university for them. We already just cannot accommodate the number of people coming through demographically. But now, with the challenge of technology, it is changing and forcing upskilling and reskilling at a pace that we've probably not anticipated before. And frankly, I'm not even sure how we'll do it. Things are moving so much faster in this technological change than in previous ones. But what is clear from a McKinsey study was that companies that are more digitally and AI capable are outperforming their laggards by sort of factors of up to 6 in terms of shareholder returns. So the imperative from the companies, at least, to close that gap, and that digital gap, is very, very high. Otherwise, they'll be out of business. So they are definitely looking to the education sector to help them in that migration. Now, they say they need to do it, but I think about 80% say they need to upskill their people in AI. Only 20% have actually got any intention to put any programs on to actually do that right now. And largely because I don't think they even know what they need. But the challenge is really there, and I think that's it. But we're developing programs with King's and with others to try and forge together, co-developed programs with industry to specifically address those needs and do practical projects that genuinely assess their capability to deliver, results for companies to be able to do things, but as well as have that critical thinking skill, reflective practice that we know is so important. But having said all of that, what I find as a real sort of dichotomy here is that some of the things that I know we're training people up for are changing themselves very fast. A lot of the professional roles, accountants, law, finance, you name it, those sort of classic white collar functions and activities are in themselves being automated and dramatically changed. I think 39-40% of key skills will change by 2030, according to some studies, that are being touted. And AI and big data are some of the new skills that everybody has to develop in place of those, and be almost tech workers alongside as good as other sort of core tech jobs, these adjacent roles are having to learn it. So that, my point being that we might be developing programs with industry for roles that will quickly disappear or substantially change. So actually, you get people like Bob Crow of ASU talking about, you know, the Renaissance learner, you know, or others about, you know, developing polymathic learners, you know, so that you're actually not learning skills and jobs anymore, because those are changing so fast. What you actually need to develop is a foundation, go back to the traditions of understanding history, arts, for the human experience, and actually focus down on some of those things, as well as biology, classic STEM subjects that give you the foundational tools to adapt to a world that's changing, to jobs that continuously shift, and actually better prepare you for that type of world where your ability to learn again, to reskill yourself, but with those foundational tools and competence, capabilities, and critical thinking to navigate that world, because nothing's going to stay the same. So I actually think it's an interesting space where, yes, we say employers are driving towards getting industry co-developed things that train you to do things, but at the same time, the speed of this change is eroding so many things that, curiously, we could end up that university's role is to go back to what it's actually traditionally good at and actually lay the foundations for people to learn and evolve rapidly.
I mean, I think that's a, I always think that's a very nice and hopeful picture of what the kind of the holistic approach to education is, that you see these technology changes driving back to some of those things that we, I guess, maybe idealize in a certain way, but are still definitely appealing. I think I want to pick up on that kind of idea of that rapid change. So I think that's been one thing that's kind of been cutting across a lot of things that have been talking, that a lot of you have been talking about. And I want to ask Sara about this, and I want to particularly think about the way that within this rapidly changing picture, I think this goes back to a little bit what Mark was just saying, that the skills are changing rapidly. But how do we think about engaging students with this? If all of a sudden we're one day we're asking the students to learn about AI, the next moment we're asking them to learn about biology, how do we make sure that the students are engaged across this entire picture?
And that's a really important question, I think, to be asking at this stage. There's there's a lot of different bits to it. As we said earlier, there's the processes of learning, and then there's the how we organize learning. I want to pick up on two, maybe a quick point on both. Firstly, how we organize learning. At the moment, one of our main impediments is that we don't have a dedicated research council for educational or information sciences. So this is something that I've been working on with colleagues around the table and beyond to try and set up a research council that would look at information and education sciences as a whole and bring together the information that's already out there, which is very fragmented across psychology, neurology, education science, biology, linguistics, you name it, cultural studies, obviously, and philosophy. We want to be able to bring that data set together. So a group of us are trying to move forward in that space. So that's really looking at the policies and the research evidence base that sits underneath what we're trying to do. On the process side, I think what's happening is a changing relationship between teachers and students, and it's a more and I think it was Sara who talked earlier about agency. It's a more self-efficacious, it's a more aware learner who isn't just learning, but maybe is teaching and learning and is peer learning and is interacting. And so there's a whole piece around activities and around processes, which I think is probably where the most exciting debates are, but where nobody really wants to talk about it because nobody wants to talk about pedagogy. So I'm sort of on my own with the likes of the people around the table in quite a rarefied area. But the point is we need to be able to adapt to changing learners, and with social media, with so much happening with the attention of students, we need to find ways to excite them, to make them want to come into the classroom, to make them really engaged and supported through, and my view of this is around using immersion and using interactive tools which are teacher-led, to try and engage students who are not really engaged in terms of a more text-heavy curriculum. And I think, I've talked quite often about the bloated curriculum and how we could reduce the curriculum by a third and leave a bit more space for personal development, social learning, and getting a bit more balance between skills and curriculum. And I think that's something we need to do, but we need to make space in the curriculum, and that's in school education, college and university. I think there's too many facts and not enough time for skill development, for discussion, for dialogue, and for the really important things that students do actually learn at university, which is about life skills and so on, as well as building up critical thinking and obviously the intellectual skills that we want them to have as they go forward in a fairly uncertain environment. But I think for me, that demotivation that we've seen with social media and with AI, I think is problematic. So we need to change the narrative around that so that students feel like there is a meaning to life and that there is a meaning to studying, and that it is exciting learning, and that they can be an active part of the society and they can change the society through research, through interaction, through community projects and engagement, and through the things that schools, colleges and universities are so good at doing. I agree with Mark. I think the weak link is sometimes between how universities and industry are picking up together, and this is part of the reason I've sort of done this dance between industry and academia to try and understand what the blockers are really here, because I think if we can really make that situation work, we can then move on quite productively forward. But when you look at edtech, that sector is not supported in the same way that engineering companies are supported by EPSRC, the Engineering Physical Sciences Research Council, for example. So I think, if we can put into play a more solid understanding of the research base, if we can try to link those elements of industry and academia together, and we can do that in a safe way, which is teacher-led, I think it's a really exciting time to be in education. And this is what keeps, pulling me back in, is the excitement of the journey and seeing the different journey that the different organisations and educational institutions have been on over the period.
So I think the one thing that you kind of were highlighting there is that you're seeing a lack of investment in certain areas in terms of research around those questions.
Yeah, and there are blockers there. There are funding blockers, but there's also, I think somebody talked earlier about low esteem of teachers. If you look at, and I work quite closely with colleagues in Finland, they have a completely different view of teachers. The best students are leaving university and going in to be teachers. The whole society welcomes them and applauds them and thinks they're amazing. And it's a different kind of culture around teaching, which I think we need to be looking at here in the UK, because low self-esteem has stood in the way of a lot of things, including not having really proper funding capabilities in play. And that does come from the bias of teachers over a long period of time and against teachers. And I think that's something we really need to address head on as a culture.
I want to open up that question of funding to the other members of the panel. Are there any good spots for funding that you're seeing? Good things that are being funded, places where you want to be able to see more funding for things? Sara.
Thanks. I mean, I want to pick up on what Sara was just saying there, which is around the sort of systematic discourse of, and this is where the political economy link I was saying earlier is really important, is that if technologies are being used to seek efficiencies in purely monetary terms rather than in broader social value terms, then it is always tempting to say, let's teach through tech or replace the teacher with tech. And Felix quite rightly earlier said, that's not it's pedagogically not possible, but it's also not desirable if you want a really quality education. So in terms of funding, I mean, often that is, Michael, exactly what is seen by cash-strapped governments as the solution. South Africa is a very good example of this. If you look at the post-secondary education and training white paper released there by the Department of Higher Education and Training, it's very clear that the imagination is monetary efficiencies gained by reducing the teaching workforce and replacing it with technology. So what I think this panel seems to be ubiquitous on is that the good funding is in maximizing the capabilities of teachers to teach with technology and about technology as well. I would say critically about technology, because as I said earlier, our technologies are not neutral and they do serve vested interests. And we want to produce generations of students who challenge those interests, who seek more egalitarian and democratic ways of using technology, not, funding Jeff Bezos's spaceships. And so that for me is where the funding needs to go positively. And there are countries that are doing this, but it's about seeing, as I said in my first statement, us as the subjects of our technology, and our teachers especially so. Our teachers especially so, not as the objects of or to be replaced by technology. And that requires, I think, one of the things that the Finnish system Sara referred to have managed to do to a certain degree, although not entirely, is to disambiguate broader social value from narrow economic value. But while countries remain cash strapped in this kind of what we call a neoliberal way of thinking about cost-driven policy making, the temptation is there. The temptation is there to go, the technology will give us these efficiencies. The biggest slice of any education budget around the world is the teacher salary wage bill. Without a doubt, the average is between 75 to 80%. And so any policymaker looking to save money will be tempted by online, asynchronous, self-driven, absent teacher learning. And if we're going to do good funding decisions, I would argue it's about capacitating our teachers to teach through technology, with technology and about technology, not replace them with technology.
I think I want to pick up on this to a question to Felix on this, because I think, Felix, you're working on a large scale project right now around teacher training and trying to get a lot of people up and running as teachers. What are the challenges with that? Particularly as I think a lot of the work you're doing is in a digital space and giving teachers training through digital tools. What are the challenges and questions that arise in developing that kind of program for teacher training?
You're absolutely right. So this is a program that is meant to train teachers in underserved communities across Africa, and it's delivered online. And what my colleagues are talking about here is the issue of funding. Obviously, this is a donor-funded program. So someone generously donated money to make education accessible. And I think the challenge we have when we think about delivering education like this is, can we have donors continuously donate money for this to be a sustainable endeavor? But there is also another way of looking at it. How do we work together as different institutions, for example? And one of the reasons I think education in a crisis, for example, is when we think about education today, we, as institutions, we want ways of making money. And the cost of universities is increasingly high. So it becomes less accessible for most people. Now, that means not just the training of teachers, but everyone involved. And that excludes more as we struggle to say, can education help us do these things? And we have our governments, for example, saying we want to fund this area of education, this area of research, where we want people who are doing engineering, we want people who are doing programming or coding, whatever you want to call it, STEM subjects. What we are doing is slightly different. We are actually investing in the teachers because we think on this program, at least, if we can train competent teachers, these are the teachers who are going to make the difference in their communities. By working with those communities, we can generate the right training for them, make sure that we support them properly, and create that change we need in those communities, instead of saying we want to be starting with science or this and everything else is defunded. Yeah.
I think I want to just to pick up a little bit on that question of funding. I want to ask Mark about this, and I think that, Mark, you have a lot of conversations with people who are working in areas of digital technology, where these companies are, as it appears popularly, bringing in a lot of revenue. Are you seeing there being an interest in funding education, even if it is just kind of in an internal sense, in these types of companies?
When you say funding education from these companies, can you just explain?
I think funding the education of their future employees, in a sense.
Yeah, no, I think what as a for-profit entities, we're not looking for sort of any government support or funding of what we would do. Usually if there's any funding, it comes with so many strings and headaches that it would ruin most private enterprises. What I think about in terms of funding, I mean, I take a slightly different view. I think there's a huge potential in. I mean, my passion is about making access to education more possible. And the thing about building humans always around every bit of education that you do is it's not very scalable, and it's also much more costly, which then creates, as Felix talks about, you create a barrier to that, and costs have gone up and up and up. So what I'm looking for government is to make funding, as it's trying to do with lifelong learning entitlement, broader, so that you can do shorter courses, micro credentials, things that will enable people to upskill themselves and reskill themselves, and actually deploy money like the way they have in Singapore with the Skills Future funds, that people, gives adults the chance to spend money through their life to help them develop, and that can be deployed anywhere. I think that's where some investment should go, because I think that's going to make the most impact for people for adult learners who are going to face the challenge of being unemployed soon, and having to reskill and upskill. I think that's where funding, for me, needs to go. And I think we should be, I don't believe teachers should be out of the loop. There's no human needs to be in the loop in higher forms of education, but I think there's a load of areas where we should be doubling down on finding ways for technology to be able to deliver sort of basic foundational knowledge, opportunities for work and self-directed skilling up with technology without humans, and in improving those experiences and finding ways to invest and measure the quality of those experiences, because I think that will open up things to a much wider audience. And I think there's always the danger of designing systems to protect the status quo, protect employment and the current employment, when actually you need to realize that may not be in the interests of a load of people who are at the moment excluded from education because of the current system and the costs that are involved.
I think that there's a nice transition here to a question from the audience, which I think I want to look at. I do want to have time to talk about AI, hopefully, as well. There's another good question about AI, but I think we talk about AI in education a lot, so I want to hold off and kind of keep that in our back pocket for a moment. But there's a wonderful question from Tamsin here. And she says, can I ask the panel's views on ed tech companies? And I think we have people here who work in ed tech. Can I ask the panel's views on ed tech companies? Should they be subject to clear governance and market standards? And following research undertaken by the LSE's Digital Futures for Children Center, do they feel confident that ed tech platforms offer sufficient protections on the student data they gather? I don't know who would want to address that question first. Sara.
Let me have a go there. Being as I have a startup company, only 1.5 years old, obviously we're still quite new. I think it's absolutely right. The question, I mean, the angle that it's coming in at around the ethics side and standards and so on. I know that Mark Lester, and I'm sure many other people in the audience as well, have been quite heavily involved in trying to get standards in play, and it's been a long battle to get things into play. And I think one of the reasons that we've been stymied has been because there hasn't been the science base sitting underneath what we're doing. And I think that this has brought about uncertainty, not just from the educators, but also on the technology side. And being someone who's sort of been on both sides of it, I can see how having a much more secure science base around what we do is going to be critical for really developing a really sensible standards base. We're all worried, I'm sure, about the rate at which these things are happening relative to what's happening and what's getting out into the classroom. So there's an imperative here to move more quickly than we have before in these areas. As a company, of course, you don't want standards in place that are going to stop or stymie experimentation. They're going to stop development and stop us from getting, the market edge that we want to get. So for me, there's always going to be a balance between, timing and effectiveness, and actually being able to actually get to compliance, because I think that's quite a long tail when you think how long it's taken just to get basic standards in place for things like AR headsets and VR headsets and so on. I mean, we're still really waiting for things to happen in a lot of areas. So yes, we would like to really advance this area, but until we get the science base right, I think we are a bit stymied, and that's why we're really sort of passionately trying to push forward with this idea for a research council, so that we can start to bring that fragmentary research base, which is, there's still a lot out there, together, so that we can actually really develop some standards that are going to be meaningful. I think on the AI side, there's an even bigger imperative in terms of the interaction between humans and in particular children with agentic technologies in particular. And I think there needs to be more of an open debate about what we need to do about that. But I think a lot of people who've been in the field for 10, 20 years, we've seen all these debates before. We're pushing hard as well on our side to get things more standardized. But it really is, it's very early days for this sector, and we haven't had the support that I think we really need to have. And I think if we can put that support in, we can definitely see some acceleration around standards, for example, which I think are really needed. So
Sara.
Yeah, I think that the question that Tamsin's asking here gets to something that's been a core tension and increasingly hot debate in education more broadly, which is the contradictory imperatives when you have education for human purposes and then education for profit purposes. And those two things don't always play nicely together. And that's not just with ed tech companies, that's with privatization of schools. Private schools also get caught twixt the Scylla and Charybdis of their students and their shareholders. And so I think it's more than, I mean, Sara alluded to sort of standards, but also having sufficiently technologically literate oversight bodies that are able to regulate and act as a counterbalance to, rapacious profit imperatives. We're seeing this with the social media companies in the US right now, where it is clear if you sit on and watch any of the C-SPAN stuff, where that you watch senators or the House try to hold technology to account, they are not equipped with the knowledge themselves to ask the right questions or to understand the mechanisms at play with technology, and particularly with children who are unable to consent. I'm thinking now about how Google has made a very, very successful endeavor of handing out Chromebooks to schools around South Africa, who, of course, are in a position where they are not able to say no. That is an offering they could not afford themselves, that they would never, what are they supposed to do? Tell their children they can never have access to computing hardware and digital equipment. And yet, while offered as philanthropic donations, we know these things do not come with no strings attached. That data is being used by Google, and those people are not informed or consenting as free willing agents. So I think it's more than just standards, but developing within the public sector the correct regulatory oversight bodies who are technologically literate to ensure that these sorts of entities are held to account when it matters, whether that's Cambridge Analytica, whether that's Facebook Meta. I think Australia is doing some good things here, but I think in the UK we're behind.
I wanna be able to get to the question of AI, but first, Mark, I think you should chime in here about standards.
Yeah, I mean, Fourth Thread partners with our university partners, and they hold us to account on standards, and so that's where it comes through. I think other ones, it will be, I think ultimately it's the students that are holding them to account to standards and the outcomes that they promise. And I think if they play fast and loose with quality, then that usually comes out in some ways. But companies get reputations for poor quality, poor outcomes. And that holds. In terms of data protection, well, obviously there's the laws of data protection apply to all edtech companies just as they would to others. So I'm less concerned on that front. I do think with AI and what you're inserting into AI is a completely different story. But that's sitting with the big seven or whatever tech companies. It's not in many cases sitting with the edtech companies that are providing a service around those foundational models.
Wonderful. And before we get to a final question about AI, Felix.
I wanted to comment this very quickly to say that sometimes we can't regulate or ask companies to follow standards about harms we don't know, because some of the new technologies we are dealing with represent certain harms that we don't know. So we may not be able to regulate or even ask them to follow standards that apply to those. But there is also another question, and that is, are we actually enforcing the regulations that already exist? Because when it comes to child protection, to data protection, there are already laws that many of these companies do not even care to follow, because we have created a kind of marriage between politics and law enforcement. On the one hand, at least the regulatory aspect of these technologies, and the technology makers. So they become like one, in a sense that you can't really get to separate them, whether it is through donations, whether it is through all these kinds of relationships, make it even harder. I think it's up to us as a society to kind of reclaim that power to regulate the tools that we use. And for us to be able to do that, it's not a matter of simply reinforcing these protections or creating new ones. It's making sure that we retain the control that we are increasingly losing.
Oh yeah, thank you for that, Felix. I think this is obviously a complex and entangled question, which is I have to thank you so much, Tamsin, for that question. We only have a few minutes left, and I want to end by giving you all a brief, very quick moment to just kind of say, to reflect on that question of AI, because we did have a question in the chat about that. What are your hopes for AI in education? What would you like to see happen with AI as it's being applied to the digital world of education? I guess I want to start with Felix.
I think the role of AI in education is going to continue to grow, but that growth should not be at the expense of what we value the most in education. So we are seeing some, again, that also depends on what we mean by AI, because it's vague, it's a marketing term basically. So being able to unpack what that means first, that is going to be important for us to be able to then work with it. And once we've unpacked it, we have to keep in mind what the purpose of the education we're trying to do. There were some references to education. I think it was part of the discussion we had earlier. We are not just about giving people knowledge and skills. That's not just education. And if it were just what Freya would call banking education, we'd be using those machines full of knowledge and giving it to other people, to young learners or to adults and everything. But that's not about education. Education is a lot more than that. People could get knowledge from libraries, from online, but the human connection, the values we cherish, the emotions we share and the bond we share as a human race, that is something teachers communicate to students, and that is something that will never go away. We need to keep that, and that's why teachers come in all the time, regardless of how powerful AI is.
Wonderful. Sara, what are your hopes for AI?
I'm going to quote someone unusual. I'm going to say, Mao Zedong said about the French Revolution, it's too soon to tell. Basically, I do hope that what's being exposed with the AI moment is that we have already built highly technicist forms of education. James Bridle often talks about how, we then bake that into our technology, we bake that into our infrastructure, but we can't blame AI for just accelerating the path we were already on, which was valuing education as the banking model, as Felix said. So I hope that really what it does is it starts people asking this question about technicism versus emancipatory education, focusing on the outcome, the qualification, the sort of can I recite the facts rather than the process, the becoming, the way we become human through our interactive education with other humans. And so, in some ways, I think that the crisis in higher education about AI, everybody's going, oh, how do we sustain academic integrity? frankly, ChatGPT has just democratized cheating. That is what it has done. But students have cheated since we started valuing the outcome over the process. And maybe the AI moment will help us to all stop, pause, and go, hang on, what are we really doing here? Isn't it the conversations? Isn't it the texture of what we do together that makes education meaningful and human? Not this just, can I bash out? The question in the chat was saying, an AI brain can hold more knowledge than a human brain. It can hold more data, but not more knowledge, and certainly not more creativity, and certainly not more compassion. So hopefully the AI moment will jolt us out of this technicist rail track we've been on, back to, as Mark mentioned earlier, the real things that make human thinking human, and thinking, not calculating.
Mark, what are your hopes for AI in education?
Well, I have to echo Sarah's last point, which is that I think it's a great opportunity now, if we embrace it, to think about. I mean, we know that the AI is redrawing the boundary between human and machine in terms of the division of responsibilities and labour. I think that's going to have to filter through into universities, schools. It will have to force all of us to reevaluate what's the role of each in delivering a quality education for people. But the other thing that I hope for, personalized learning, informal learning that you can direct yourself, that speaks to you to achieve the goals that you're looking for. That sort of personalization has always been out of reach. It's just too expensive. But I think where I see AI as bringing real potential is making that personalization to wherever you are in the world, whatever level, really become possible. And for educators currently who are trying to build higher order skills, a wonderful mechanism to bring to life scenarios, simulations, authentic ways of doing things that that really inspire students in a way that a textbook, for example, just would never do. You see it with Northwestern University changing their MBA to create, rather than a case study that you read and you just go through, they have trained AI to represent different business leaders within the company, and you have to figure out what's going on and how to solve it. So it makes it an interactive, dynamic, living thing, as opposed to some dry piece of written text. So I think, again, there's lots of positives to strike, without forgetting the problem that we have, which is that it can be abused and misused, and undermine critical thinking in the same time. We have to get very smart to teach students and staff how to use it in the right way to deepen learning.
Wonderful. And Sara, as a last word, what is your hope for AI in education?
Yeah, I'll try and be quick. I mean, I thought actually a good place to end is with the beginning. And of course, Alan Turing in the 1950s wrote his famous paper where he asked, can machines think? Now, it wasn't a brand or anything. He didn't come up with the idea of artificial intelligence. He called it artificial life. And I think it's actually worth, if you can, go back to that paper. Read the paper. It's very, very short. It's also the second most quoted philosophical paper. So it's actually worth reading, even if you're coming from a philosophy point of view and you're not from a technology point of view. But in that paper, he sets out the key issues, which I think have been summarized actually really well by Mark and colleagues around the table. This is about life. This is about human behavior, but it's also about hybrids and hybrid systems. And I think the future will be really defining what those hybrid systems are. So for me, I suppose it would be a plea as an educator. Go and read the paper by Alan Turing and think about it, because these are quite deep philosophical questions, and they're ethical questions as well. And I realise that I'm standing in the way of people going home, so I will wrap up here. But it's been a really great session, and thanks everyone for your amazing insights. Michael.
Yeah. So thank you all. Thank you, Felix. Thank you, Sara. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Sara, for all of your contributions. I think we could spend all evening continuing to talk about this. I think that the Digital Futures Institute's next Living Well with Technology event will be in February around Valentine's Day and the Digital Future of Love, which should be an amazing event. So please sign up for our mailing list if you would like to find out more, or you'd like to see any of the recordings of our previous events as well. So thank you again to all of our speakers. Thank you to the audience, and thank you to Fumi and Charlotte for working things behind the scenes. I think it was a wonderful, wonderful event. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.